How could a widow in a drafty cabin survive a Kansas winter with half the firewood by hanging her quilts instead of wrapping in them? It defied everything people knew about staying warm, but Delia Marsh had to try something. She was driving a wooden peg into the north wall of her cabin, about 5 centimeters from the timber, when Prudence Caldwell walked in. Prudence did not knock. She just stared at the quilt Delia was hanging. "What in heaven's name are you doing?" she asked. Delia did not stop. "Insulating," she said. She hammered another peg. The idea was to create a gap. The log walls let in too much cold. The quilts, she hoped, would stop it. Prudence adjusted her spectacles, her disapproval clear. "That's not how quilts work, Mrs. Marsh. You're supposed to wrap yourself in them, not hang them like curtains." She looked at the colorful fabric. "And using your grandmother's quilts as wall hangings? That's disrespectful to the dead." Delia met her gaze. "My grandmother would rather keep me alive than be respected in a drawer." She finished with the last peg. The quilt hung straight, a 5 centimeters pocket of air behind it, between the fabric and the rough log wall. "If you've come to help, I have more pegs. If you've come to lecture, I don't have the time." Prudence ignored the dismissal. "The Women's Auxiliary is meeting tomorrow. We're concerned you're not managing well, living alone, winter coming, barely enough wood to last until Christmas." Her voice was soft, but it carried a hint of satisfaction. "Mr. Caldwell knows a widower in Dodge City. He might be interested in a young wife." "I could write to him for you." Delia shook her head. "I'm not interested in a husband, Mrs. Caldwell. I'm interested in surviving the winter. You won't survive hanging quilts on your walls. You need firewood. You need a man to cut it. You need to accept that a woman alone cannot." Prudence paused. "Thank you for your concern. The door is behind you." Prudence left with her spine stiff. Her disapproval radiated like heat from a stove. It was ironic. Her advice would have left Delia freezing. Subscribe before we get to the part that reframes the whole thing. It happens fast, and I don't want you to miss it. Samuel Marsh died in September. An axe slipped while he cut wood, leaving a deep gash on his hand. It turned red, then black. 3 days of fever took him. No prayer or poultice could stop it. Delia was left with a half-finished woodpile and a drafty cabin. Her land claim was worth nothing if she couldn't prove it up by spring. The other settlers had their expectations. Widows sold out. They remarried. They left the prairie. Delia stayed. Staying meant finding a way to survive on what little firewood she had. She needed a solution, fast. She found Mrs. Lindgren at the general store in town. Mrs. Lindgren was old. She was foreign. She talked too much about Sweden. Most people avoided her. But Delia had nowhere else to be. She had nothing to lose. She stopped. She listened. Mrs. Lindgren's accent was thick, but her meaning was clear. In Sweden, Mrs. Lindgren had explained, her accent thick, but her words clear. Still, air does not conduct heat. Moving air, yes, it steals the warmth and carries it away. But air that cannot move, it is like a blanket. It holds the warmth in. This was the core lesson. Air that is trapped, unable to circulate, acts as a barrier. It stops heat from moving through it. We call this dead air. It is air held in a space, unable to move. It cannot steal warmth. Imagine hanging a curtain 5 centimeters from a cold wall. The air between the curtain and the wall becomes dead air. It sits still. The cold from the wall hits this trapped air and stops. Your room stays warm. The still air prevents the cold from reaching you. Delia looked at her cabin with new eyes. Its walls were logs, sealed with mud and straw. But the chinking had cracks. Gaps in the logs let the wind blow through. She could feel it. More mud could seal the cracks, but mud took time to dry. Winter was coming fast. Blankets could cover the walls, but a blanket flat against a log would just get cold. It would conduct the chill right into the room. But blankets hung 5 centimeters from the wall with dead air trapped behind them? That was different. That was insulation. She could create it in a day. She had the materials. It was a solution she had never considered. The hanging took 2 days. Delia drove wooden pegs into the log walls at the top, spacing them every 45 centimeters. From these, she hung ropes that held the quilts exactly 5 centimeters from the timber. She used every quilt she owned. The ones her grandmother had made, the ones her mother gave her when she married, even the ones she and Samuel bought in Wichita on their honeymoon. She made choices. The north wall got the heaviest quilts, the ones with the thickest batting, because the north wall faced the wind that came down from Canada without anything to stop it. Lighter quilts went on the east and west walls. For the south wall, with its single window, Delia chose a quilt that could be pulled aside each day. This let in whatever weak winter sun Kansas offered. Around the door, she sealed the gaps with strips of wool cut from an old blanket. This created a gasket, blocking the drafts that used to whistle through every time the wind blew. Then, she hung a second curtain 90 centimeters inside the door. This created an airlock, like the one Mrs. Lindgren had described from her childhood home in Uppsala. Any cold air that got past the main door would hit this second curtain and stop. It couldn't reach the main room. When she finished, the cabin looked strange. Walls covered in quilts, the door wrapped in wool, curtains hanging in places where curtains shouldn't be. That evening, after 2 days of work, Delia lit the stove. She sat down and waited. Within an hour, she felt the difference. The room was warm. Not just less cold, but truly warm. It was the kind of warm that let you take off your shawl and sit comfortably. The kind of warm that didn't require feeding the stove every 30 minutes. The quilts hung still on their pegs. The air trapped behind them worked exactly as Mrs. Lindgren had promised. It stopped the cold. It held the heat. Her drafty cabin felt almost cozy. Delia went to bed with the stove banked low. She expected to wake up freezing, just like every night since Samuel died. Instead, she woke up comfortable. The room was still warm. The fire still burned gently in its bed of coals. The dead air had held the heat all night. It had kept the warmth inside. It meant she would need less wood. This immediate success was clear, but the long-term impact on her wood supply and how the community would react was still a mystery. Subscribe for that story. The proof lands in the next few minutes, and it's not what anyone expected. The news spread fast. It was all over the settlement. The Marsh widow and her quilted walls. The women whispered about it at church. They talked at the store. They gathered at the wells for water, and the story got bigger. Prudence Caldwell made sure everyone knew. Delia had hung her grandmother's quilts like curtains. Her cabin looked like a fabric store. She was clearly losing her grip on proper housekeeping along with everything else. It's not natural, Prudence told anyone who would listen. Quilts belong on beds, not walls. She's making a spectacle of herself, and when she freezes to death in January, we'll all have to deal with the consequences. But December came. Delia didn't freeze. January arrived, and her woodpile barely shrank. February blew in, the coldest month of the year. Still, Delia was burning less than half the wood she had used the winter before. That was when Samuel was alive, when he fed the stove around the clock. Prudence decided to visit one February afternoon. She rode in the minister's wagon, wrapped in so many layers she looked like a woolen boulder. She found Delia outside feeding the chickens. Delia wore only a wool dress and a light shawl. Prudence didn't want to step inside. She had spent months telling everyone in the settlement that Delia Marsh would freeze, that her quilted walls were foolishness. She had predicted Delia would come crawling for help before Christmas. Now it was February, the coldest month, and Delia was standing outside feeding chickens in a light shawl. Her woodpile, which should have been gone, was still half full. Prudence climbed down from the minister's wagon and followed Delia into the cabin. The warmth hit her like a wave. The cabin was comfortable, almost mild. It was the kind of warmth Prudence usually found in houses with 2 stoves burning all day. But here, there was only one stove. It was burning low, barely crackling. Nothing like the roaring fires Prudence kept in her own home. How? Prudence asked. Her voice was smaller than usual, stripped of its usual certainty. How is it this warm? You've barely got a fire going. The quilts, Delia said. She gestured at the walls, at the fabric hanging 5 centimeters from every surface at the dead air spaces Prudence had mocked for months. They trap a layer of air between themselves and the walls. The air can't move, so it can't carry the heat away. The cold from the walls hits that dead air and stops. The warmth stays in the room instead of bleeding out through the logs. That's not possible. It's happening right now, Delia said. You're standing in it. She pulled a chair from the table and gestured for Prudence to sit. Would you like some coffee? The pot's been warm all morning. Doesn't take much heat to keep it that way when the heat doesn't escape. Prudence sat. She drank the coffee. She looked at the quilts on the walls, at the curtain by the door, at the stove that was barely burning. She looked at the room, warmer than her own house, where she kept 2 fires going all day long. "How much wood have you burned this winter?" she asked. "About 4 cords. Maybe 4.5. 4 cords. Prudence's voice was flat. "I've burned 9. My husband has burned 11 in the church. You don't have dead air spaces," Delia said. "Your heat goes straight through the walls and out into the prairie." She sipped her own coffee, watching the minister's wife over the rim of the cup. "Mrs. Lindgren taught me. The Swedish woman who lives past the creek. Her people have been doing this for centuries." Prudence snorted. "Still, air doesn't conduct heat. It's just physics. It's foreign nonsense. It's keeping me alive while you burn 11 cords trying to heat a church with gaps in the walls." Delia set down her cup and leaned forward. Her gray-green eyes were steady on the woman who had wanted her to fail. "You told everyone I would freeze. You told everyone I needed a husband. You told everyone a woman alone couldn't survive a Kansas winter. How's that working out for you, Mrs. Caldwell?" Prudence Caldwell left. But the story of Delia Marsh and her quilted walls didn't die out. Now, it wasn't mockery. It was curiosity. People traveled to Delia's cabin. They wanted to see the strange walls, to feel the impossible warmth. They wanted to understand how still air could do what roaring fires couldn't. Mrs. Lindgren came with them. She would point out all the small details Delia had gotten right. The 5-centimeter gap between the fabric and the logs, the heavy quilts on the north wall, the airlock at the door, how the fabrics hung perfectly straight, never touching the cold timber behind them. Mrs. Lindgren drew diagrams in the dust with a stick. She explained the physics in her broken English. She showed them how still air trapped heat and how moving air stole it away. 6 families hung quilts that spring. Winter was over, but the memory of the cold was still fresh. By the next fall, before the first snow, 12 more families had quilted their homes. Then, by the winter of 1887, half the settlement had quilted walls. The demand for heavy fabric drove prices up at the general store. Prudence Caldwell never apologized. She never said she was wrong. She never admitted that she had mocked something she didn't understand. She never acknowledged that she had wanted a widow to fail, just so her own beliefs would be proven correct. But she stopped telling people Delia needed a husband. She stopped predicting disaster. Eventually, she stopped visiting altogether, which suited Delia just fine. Old Mrs. Lindgren died peacefully in the spring of 1888. She was in her own cabin, the one she had quilted 40 years before. Delia sat with her at the end, holding the hand of the woman who had taught her. Warmth, Mrs. Lindgren had shown her, wasn't about fighting the cold. It was about understanding it. "In Sweden, Mrs. Lindgren said, her voice thin but clear, "we learned the cold is not an enemy. It is a fact, like the sun or the rain. You don't fight facts. You work with them." She paused. "You find where the heat goes, and you stop it there. You find where the cold comes from, and you put something in its way. Still air, dead air, air that does nothing, and in doing nothing, does everything." The old woman smiled, her silver braids loose on the pillow. "You did good, Delia, better than I expected. Now you teach the others." Delia Marsh stayed on the Kansas prairie for another 43 years. She remarried in 1889. His name was Josiah Green, a farmer. He had come to see her quilted walls, and he fell in love with the woman who had hung them. They raised 5 children together. All of them grew up in a house where the walls were quilted, the fire burned low, and winter couldn't steal the warmth, no matter how hard it tried. The technique spread. It went beyond the settlement, beyond Kansas, beyond the prairie itself. People called it different things. Quilt insulation, dead air spacing, the Swedish method. But the principle was always the same. Still, air doesn't conduct heat. If you can trap it, you can keep your warmth. The original cabin is gone now. It was torn down in 1923 when Delia and Josiah built a proper frame house on the same site. But the quilt survived. It passed down through generations. Each one carried the story of that winter when a widow hung them 5 centimeters from her walls. She proved that warmth wasn't about how much wood you burned. It was about how much heat you kept. The Historical Society has one of them now, Delia's grandmother's quilt, the one she hung on the north wall that first November. The display card explains the dead air principle. It mentions it was brought to Kansas by Swedish immigrants. It notes it was popularized by a widow named Delia Marsh, who refused to freeze when everyone expected her to. What in heaven's name was she doing? She was surviving. She was teaching. She was building a legacy of warmth, one quilt at a time. The real lesson here isn't about physics. It's about what happens when you stop fighting the world around you and start to understand it. Subscribe if this kind of hidden history is your thing. There are more stories of forgotten wisdom right here. And tell me in the comments, what old knowledge do you think we've forgotten that still holds a powerful, simple truth?